Absolutely. It starts at the top. It starts with leadership.
Hmm.
And it can't be something you're just giving lip service to. You have to follow through and you have to give people the space and the grace to fail
Yeah.
and to help them to learn from that and move past that. So that's the first thing. Another thing you have to do as a leader is you have to model that behavior. If I make a mistake, if I fail at something within my organization, I tell everybody, I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, well, this wasn't the right choice. And here's why. What can we learn from that? And how do we move forward with it?
Mhm.
So if you're afraid to admit your own failures, don't expect that your teams are going to feel comfortable admitting theirs.
All right. Welcome back to Exploring Growth. Today, I want to explore the idea of creating a culture where failure is respected or even expected. My guest is Karen Wright Gordon, CEO of Five Dynamics. Welcome to the show, Karen.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate you having me here.
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and I think it will become clear to our listeners what we're really talking about here when we talk about failure. But it's not natural for people to lean into failure. We've been conditioned from an early age to succeed at everything, and honestly, to a unhealthy level of perfection. So I'm excited about talking about failure. As
Great.
we get before we get into that, though, just kind of give us a quick background on your company, Five Dynamics, your role, and kind of who you help and what you guys do.
Yeah, so I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've had multiple businesses. My most recent is Simplify, powered by Five Dynamics. I've had this one for 14 years. And what I love about it is that what we do is that we help people to get unstuck. We help teams to collaborate more effectively. We help them to understand what they see naturally, what they might miss, where they could use some outside support, and just how to value one another.
Love it. That's great. Okay, so let's dive into this idea that we've been kind of chatting about offline, and that is creating an environment of failure. Okay, so at first glance, that's like kind of counterintuitive because I think everybody, has nightmares at night thinking that things aren't going to go the way they should go. And we get to this point of perfection, like things have to operate. We want more efficiency. We want better, more successful. So let's sort of frame this out. What does an environment of failure look like? I mean, if you were to create that for a company and have them start thinking about that, how would you direct them?
It's really all about intelligent failure. So I
Okay.
wanted to define that early on. Amy Edmondson has a great new book. It talks about the right kind of wrong and it looks at failure. And one of the types of failure is intelligent failure, which is basically you do your homework and then you do thoughtful experimentation. Because
Mm.
what you're trying to do is you're trying to innovate. You're trying something new. There is no data to support what you're doing. And so it just follows that you're going to have failures along the way. Inventors, certainly, they have failures. There's a famous quote from Thomas Edison that says, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. Because that's how you get to something that does work, is that you iterate. And, fail fast. It's a mantra in Silicon Valley, overused, quite honestly, and not always followed appropriately. But it's about, we're startups, we're aggressive, we're trying something new, we're building something, and it's better to fail fast and fail quickly, so you can pivot and get to the right idea. And so you have to create a culture where it's okay to have those failures and you have to learn from them. That's the second piece. You have to make sure that you're going back and you're reviewing, okay, what did we do? Why didn't it work? All right, how are we going to tweak that? What are we going to try
Mhm.
differently? So when I'm talking about failure, I'm not saying mistakes. It's not about not looking at your data and just making lots of mistakes. That's not
Mhm.
okay, especially if that happens over and over again. But it's about risk taking and innovating and being willing to try something that hasn't been tried before.
Yeah. Okay. So it's more about experimenting as a philosophy than being sort of plan A is the plan.
Right. Experimenting and knowing that failure is going to be a part of that and being
Mhm.
okay with that. As a matter of fact, I mentioned Amy Edmondson. Her first book and what she's the most well known for is psychological safety. And
Okay.
in the process of doing her research at Harvard around psychological safety, she went into hospital settings and she felt like Teams that had psychological safety would have fewer mistakes than teams who had low psychological safety, meaning they trusted one another.
Yes.
They were open, they were able to support one another. And what she found was just the opposite. And she felt like she had failed because she had taken up the time of these healthcare professionals. They had done these studies over a long period of time. She had great sponsors who'd been supporting her. And then the data proved different than what she expected.
Hmm.
But what she realized was not that they had fewer failures, but that they were more open and honest about those failures. So they learned from those failures. So the teams that had low psychological safety, they were afraid to fail. Well, what happens in a healthcare environment when you don't tell others how you failed, what went wrong? It could be life or death. If you're not sharing
Yeah.
that learning, you're not learning from it, then you're not moving forward. So it completely shifted her research when she recognized that, no, failure is a good thing. And teams with high psychological safety, they're willing to admit those failures and learn from them, which is much more important. So again, low psychological safety didn't have fewer failures. They just weren't honest about their failures.
Ah, okay. That's a key point. And it's funny when you're talking about the healthcare, what pops in my mind is my wife and my oldest daughter have been, well, watching for my oldest daughter and rewatching for my wife, ER, the series back in the 90s. And, it's kind of like, I don't know, my wife's like rite of passage for my daughter. Like she loved the show and she wanted to take her through it. And so I'm, not big into it, but I'll sit in there every once in a while, hang out with them, and I'm watching a few of the episodes, and they're good episodes. It was really good TV back then.
Mm-hmm.
And what stands out is these instances that are scripted, but they're really kind of based on real life instances in the ER where someone is demonstrating that low safety, low psychological safety, where the transparency is not there, and you can see the calculation that's happening in the drama where they're saying to themselves, okay, what action should I take now? Because if I go down this path, it's going to possibly result in getting fired. If I go down this path, it's going to result in maybe being, some kind of regulatory action or, up the chain. Or as a resident, maybe I won't progress on this year into the program. There's all these things going through their mind when they're trying to make a decision about a patient and the care they're giving to a patient. And I think that that's such a interesting connection, because what you're saying is that if they had an environment where it wasn't, it was more transparent and they were allowed to fail, obviously to a certain degree, because you can't take risk with a patient's life. But in the way you're doing your job and communicating with your fellow, residents or doctors, I think there's room for innovation to happen there as well. But I don't know. I think the environment is very interesting, because one environment versus another environment, you get two totally different. I mean, healthcare, which is historically slow and slow to change and lots of hurdles and barriers. And then you have tech, which is like kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, where they're always moving fast and breaking things, as you said, almost to their detriment. I think the environment, the culture that's built from the top, the leadership, makes so much difference in the production of innovative thinking and sort of failing forward, sort of. I don't want to say lifestyle, but just that culture of thinking in the company. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. It starts at the top. It starts with leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And it can't be something you're just giving lip service to. You have to follow through, and you have to give people the space and the grace to fail,
Yeah.
and to help them to learn from that and move past that. So that's the first thing. Another thing you have to do as a leader is you have to model that behavior. If I make a mistake, if I fail at something within my organization, I tell everybody. I'm like, oh, yeah, well, this wasn't the right choice, and here's why. What can we learn from that, and how do we move forward with it? Mm-hmm. So if you're afraid to admit your own failures, don't expect that your teams are going to feel comfortable admitting theirs. Yeah. So you have to create that atmosphere that encourages that. Another great example of that, and this is a story that goes around. I don't know if it's 100% true or not, but apparently Tom Watson Jr., who was the CEO of IBM at the time, he had an executive who he failed at something and he lost a couple of $1 million. And he
Hmm.
was called into Tom's office fully expecting to be fired. And Tom said, "Hey, why would I do that? I just spent $2 million on your education. So let's
Yeah.
learn from it and let's move forward." Right. And so it takes that type of leadership where you're willing. Now, I don't know that I would do it if it was millions of dollars, but,
Yeah.
certainly you want to create that type of environment where it's okay. But what's key also is that you have to make sure that you're not skipping that evaluation phase. You go back and you look at, okay, why
Mm,
did we fail? What can we
yeah.
learn from this failure? What can we do better next time?
So, okay, because that was my next question is how do you create this type of environment, like a safe culture, a culture of learning? How do you do that? And what I'm hearing you say is leadership needs to demonstrate it from the top first, because and I've been a part of companies that are, one side or the other. And when it's demonstrated and they are okay with innovating, they're okay with experimenting and failing and kind of being naked in front of the company and saying, look, I made these decisions and they didn't work out and we're going to work through them. It empowers you, the lower level employee, to do the same thing. So, when you get to the evaluation stage, what does that look like? Is it kind of like a process oriented logistical type of thing, or is it more of just I don't know, a point in the I don't know, really not really sure how to think about it.
Yeah, well, one of the ways that we do it is that when something goes wrong, we just pull people together and we say, look, this is a no blame retrospective. We're not looking
Hmm.
to find blame. We're not looking to point the finger at anyone. We're all trying to learn from this.
Yeah.
So then people are more open about putting it out on the table and really being honest about what went wrong. I think it's harder for some than it is for others. I know that it is based off of their energetic preferences, which aligns with our model. But you
Hmm.
have to have that growth mindset. You have to be willing to learn from things and recognize that, yeah, I made a mistake, but how do I move forward from here?
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is great. I'm learning a lot here because I think that culture really drives the majority of business outcomes. Honestly, I think that leadership and vision are two of the biggest components to leaders that actually have a vision they're going after passionately. And when they're doing that, they are breaking things and moving fast usually, and demonstrating failure, experimentation. That creates a culture. I work with a lot of different clients, and I walk into these companies and I see their culture, and it's very much dictated by the CEO, generally, or a handful of executives, and it's kind of built around their personality. Like if you look at a small business owner and the business that they're running, if it's never gets any bigger, their business looks like them. It's sort of like their family, their child that they're raising. When you get to the bigger level, the mid-size, second stage, the company looks like the CEO that's in charge. And you can see this too in the market when you have, like, recently, the Chipotle CEO moved over to Starbucks, which is funny. I've seen some memes where there have a Starbucks employee. This is someone on Instagram, a Starbucks employee, and say, okay, they just take you down the Chipotle line and say, okay, what coffee do you want? What milk do you want? It's kind of a funny thing, like borrowing from Chipotle's process. But I think the culture of Starbucks is going to completely change because the CEO changed, right? So I think that it has to start there, but culture is really what drives a lot of the business outcomes. And so my question, I'm kind of curious, is to know, when companies lean into innovation, they lean into experimenting and this idea of failure, does that positively reflect back on business outcomes like revenue growth or net profit?
Well, first have to look at kind of where is the company in its growth stage. So is this
Hmm.
a young company? Is this a startup? Is this a new idea that they're working on? That's where I would highly encourage this culture of being able to fail and learn from those failures. Now, you want to do that everywhere, but it's more important because you're at that stage where you're figuring it out. When it's a well-established company, then it's more about optimization. You've already had the great idea. And I'll tell you what Google does, for example,
Hmm.
is that they're a behemoth, they're a massive organization. So when they have new ideas, they know that they're too structured, they're too, process oriented, it takes too long. So what they do is they spin it off and they allow, the leadership team of this new concept to be a startup. and then they buy the
Mm.
company back once they're successful.
Yeah.
Because it's harder for a large corporation like that to take a lot of chances. So
Yeah.
let's pull it off. Let's make it something separate, which is kind of what we do in the software space. Is that we take bets, but they're not massive bets. We do
Hmm.
MVPs, or minimum viable products. Let's
Right.
try this. Let's test it with the market. Okay, how did that work? Oh, they didn't
Hmm.
like that part. Let's take that out. So again, you've got this culture of experimentation as you're trying to continue to build your business.
Yeah. Talking about the Google as an example, it makes me think of like maybe an other side of this coin, which is ownership. I subscribe to the Jocko Willink philosophy of extreme ownership, where as the company owner, leadership, CEO, whoever, you're owning all the problems that are
Mm-hmm.
below you. And I think that by demonstrating again to your company, your people, that you're owning the problems, that's another way to show them that, hey, it's okay to take these small bets, but own the result, right? And I think that can all play out in that evaluation stage.
Yeah, and you were talking about the leadership and how the culture tends to align with the leaders.
Hmm.
And that is true. Without awareness, that's what happens. But that's actually when they call us in, is because they realize, hey, maybe my way isn't the way. And I learned that
Yeah.
lesson the hard way in my first
Yeah.
company. We had 1,100% growth in a 3-year time frame, so we were moving, getting lots of contracts, growing very quickly, hiring lots of people. But I had my blind spots. And by the way, we all do. None of us come here as natural born leaders. That's a myth. None of us have, in our terminology, high energy and all of the dynamics that are required.
Hmm.
And any leader needs to recognize, where do I lean in naturally? What do I miss? And then what do I do about those areas that I miss? So, for example, for me, I'm a big picture thinker and I like to get things done. So I move quickly. I have ideas and then I'm wanting to do it. But I know that when I have these big ideas, I need to talk to those people on my team who are my thoughtful and my careful planners. In our
Hmm.
terminology, our high examines, because their gift is in finding what's wrong with something. And I want to talk to them. I don't want to talk to them when I'm first formulating the idea, because they're going to be negative and, it'll kind of shut down that
Yeah.
exploration
Right.
phase
Yeah.
for me. But I do want to talk to them absolutely before I go to market or spend millions of dollars trying to develop a new product,
Right.
because they will see things that I didn't see. And I know that. And
Yeah.
then I also know the other people that I need to lean heavily on are the ones who are great at getting the message out there.
Hmm.
That's not my forte. I like creating and doing and moving and going to the next thing. And, but taking the time to make sure people understand, what did we create? How
Yeah.
does this apply to me? I mean, that's just not my natural tendency. So again, that's where you really have to look at your culture. It's not just about your way or the highway, but it's about, okay, what are my strengths? What do
What's
I
the makeup?
naturally, yeah. And
Yeah.
then where do I need support? And so it's not about putting people on your leadership team who are just like you. That's a recipe for disaster. You
Yeah.
want those people who are very smart, hardworking, willing to lean in, but you're going to have tension and conflict in that room because you're coming from different perspectives. But
Yeah.
that's okay. That's what makes great teams, is that respectful conflict.
So, of these sort of quadrants that you're defining, which of these is more naturally inclined to lean into experimenting and be okay with failure versus not?
Yeah, great question. Let me just tell you what the dynamics are. There's 5 dynamics, as in
Okay.
the name.
Yep.
And the first is around ideation. It's called high explorer. People who have high energy and explore are all about the big picture, seeing things that don't seem like they would be naturally connected, but you see those connections, make those connections. You're
That
able to
sounds
see,
familiar.
yeah, uh, yeah, able to see 2 and 3 steps down the road, and you're not risk averse because you like
Right.
breaking things. You like trying new things.
Right.
The second dynamic is called high excite. And excite is about the people, making sure that the people are taken care of, making sure that they have what they need, making sure the customers are taken care of, understanding what success looks like and how we're going to celebrate it. Those people, they care deeply and they have a harder time with failure. Not that they, again, we can all learn this and build this muscle, but their natural kind of go-to stance is that they have a harder time because they feel like it's a personal failure. They
Mm.
internalize it. I messed up. I let the company down. Whereas someone like myself, who I love, just coming up with things and trying things, doesn't ever bother me. I just move to the next thing.
Yeah.
And then the third dynamic is someone who's high in examine. These people rarely make mistakes. They are detail oriented. They are precise. They are deep thinkers. They're the ones when you walk in their office, you may be standing there for 15 minutes because they are so deep in a task. They don't want to look up. They're very, very thorough. They're
Yeah.
slow to speak in a meeting. They only speak when they feel like they know exactly what's going on. But when they do speak, it's kind of like E.F. Hutton, you better be listening when they do speak up. Not to show my age, because,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
obviously an old reference.
Right.
And then the fourth measured dynamic is called execute. And it's about just getting things done, moving quickly. People who are high in execute, they're focused on don't put barriers in my way, don't keep me from being able to get things done quickly. And so when
Yeah.
they fail, it's more about it slowed them down. It's a little bit harder for
Yeah.
them to accept that failure because it just made it harder for them to accomplish their goals. And they're all about accomplishment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what we teach people is, hey, this is your baseline. But now let's think about this differently. We need to, again, flex those muscles. As speaking of muscles, I mean, elite athletes are great at this. If you think about it, they fail more times than they succeed, but they learn from those failures. And so
Yes.
they're more comfortable with the concept of failure.
Yeah, I mean that's a great analogy. Consistently failing and incrementally improving, and those increments are so small. I mean, we just had the Olympics come through, and you look at how small of an increment it was from the winner, who's the world champion that everyone knows now, and the loser who no one has a clue who they are. There's a funny Seinfeld bit on that where he talks about the winner is here, and then the loser, someone we don't know about, is here.
Yeah.
Like just a 100 millionth of a second less. But I think that's very true. Those increments of growth and sticking to it, it being consistent about the work is very important. Those are very interesting dynamics. I mean, I think I identify with a couple of them right off the bat. And it makes me think, yeah, okay, the natural next step is I need to put the other people that I'm not like around me and kind of have that rub that's not going to be as comfortable because I'm not naturally inclined, as they are. But I think that would help me to build what I'm building.
Yeah. And what you may have noticed is that I didn't talk about personality because that's not what we look
Right.
at. It's
Yeah.
about process. And so when I listed those 4 of the 5 dynamics, because 4 are measured, the 5th is evaluate and it's not measured. What
Okay.
we're measuring are the most efficient neural pathways in your brain. What do you go to quickly? What have you trusted? What have you learned to trust because you've had positive feedback over the years? And when you look at the dynamics, it follows the way that work gets done. Someone has an idea. Someone gets people on board with that idea. Someone creates a detailed plan and someone executes. Now, it can be one person doing some of these things and others doing others. And sometimes we do things that aren't necessarily natural to us because we understand that it's an important phase because all 4 of those phases are equally as important to success. We've proven that diverse teams outperform all others. That diversity of work styles, that diversity of thinking, to make sure that you're addressing all of the elements. The market. What is the market? What is the available market? How are we going to get people engaged with this concept? What's the plan so we can have an efficient and effective rollout? And we've got to get this done. And so we all have different levels of energy for that, which is, again, what we're measuring in 3 minutes or less is what are those preferences for you? And then sometimes we know our strengths can become our weaknesses if we overuse them. And perfect example, in my first company, I did not have an awareness. I was in my early 20s when I founded the company, went from just me to 50 employees in 3 years. And I would go from idea to action to idea to action to idea to action. And it gave the employees whiplash. It was like watching a tennis match, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't give them time to understand what's my part in this idea? What am I responsible for? What's the plan? When is this due by? And so it just kept everyone in this constant heightened state, which you'll oftentimes see with very entrepreneurial companies.
Right.
And so it wasn't until I had that revelation of, oh, this is why they're frustrated. This is why they're burnt out. What do I need to do differently?
That's huge. Yeah.
And slow down, just slow it down a little bit. We'll get there, but let's get there in the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great personal sort of testimony of that experience. And I think the opposite to be true, probably for someone who needs to speed it up. that may be that deep thinker and needs a little bit more action, and less planning and less process. So then back to my question, I would assume that the explorer, or that first one you mentioned, would be more prone to experimentation. But as I'm thinking through it, that deep thinker, the one that is more precise, I would think they would be less inclined to experimenting or failure. But, and not to, kind of take this meta, but like, you know, someone who thinks deeply has to be open to lots of ideas in order to get to that deeper thought and conclusion. So I would think that in a way that they're taking their own maybe boxed in experiments and failing in a certain way, but it just may be more internal
Right.
versus being external.
Yep.
What have you seen?
Absolutely. You're 100% correct on that. I have a gentleman on my team. He is a very deep thinker.
Mhm.
He's the one that he's going to sit in 4 meetings before you ever hear a peep. And people are like, why is he here? They're all trying to figure it out. And then on that fifth meeting, after he's gotten it all sorted and he's
Yep.
tested it and, he's ready to go, then it's like, whoa, okay, yeah, you're right. We didn't think of that. We all miss that.
Yes.
And so it just takes them longer to get there. But yes, people with high explorer energy, we're constantly churning with ideas. We're constantly thinking. I can't drive through a town without thinking, oh, they need this business or that
Yeah.
business. I
Uh-huh.
see opportunity everywhere.
Yeah.
But then I have my husband, who he's one of those that he's very high in examine. And so he's a
Okay.
great counterbalance to me.
Yeah.
He'll say, okay, but is this a good idea because X, Y, and Z, and make me really kind of slow down and test things before I bring them to market. So,
Yeah, and that goes back to, I think, the one of the first things you said about it being intellectual failure or intellectual experimenting, or I'm sorry, intelligent
mhm.
experimentation. Because for someone like yourself, if you allowed yourself to just continue to be distracted by the shiny objects, driving through the towns and just dreaming, well, at some point you're not using wisdom to keep moving forward and experimenting. You're failing, putting failure behind failure. That's the same thing. So I think it probably would apply differently through the different types, but I think there's some wisdom that has to be applied at some point, which starts with the thinking, the intelligent part of it. It can't just be mistakes, as you mentioned before.
Mhm. Yeah, and there's also an element of resilience. You have to be
Yes.
resilient if you bounce back from these failures and keep moving forward. Oftentimes, people just want to, if they fail at something, they just want to implode. Last night, I was actually on a call with a bunch of amazing women business owners and leaders, VP level and above, and major, massive Fortune 1000 companies. And there was one lady in particular that she just went through this process of having a startup, and she got funded initially, but then she wasn't able to get the next round of funding. And so she had to unfortunately close down her business. But she was already on the call saying, but here's the new idea. Here's what I'm going to do. And she had already thought it out. She had her pricing. She had all these things. And it was a great idea.
Yeah.
But if she had just like, woe is me, this is terrible, I failed at this, she wouldn't be able to move to this next great thing. And we know that
Right.
all great creators, they failed many times. Abraham Lincoln, I don't have all the dates and the details, but look him up sometime and look at his failures. Tried to get elected to so many things
Yeah.
and wasn't, and then finally became the president of the United States and is
Yeah.
revered as one of the greatest ones ever. But it was because he was resilient and he just kept
Yes.
moving forward.
Yeah. You look at most any stat, golf stats or baseball stats or football stats, and you see far much more failure than you do success. And it's hard for us in any domain or stage or whatever we're doing to accept the fact that that is what is happening, but we're just seeing it play out bit by bit, kind of like watching water boil.
Yeah, I saw it with two of my children when they were growing up as well. They were both athletes. One was a naturally gifted athlete.
Mm-hmm.
Anything she did, she just immediately excelled at it.
Mm-hmm.
The other, he was pretty good, but he had to work. He had to work
Mm-hmm.
really hard, and he ended up being recruited to play, football at college level. He didn't do it, but he had plenty of offers and was able
Yeah.
to do that. But the difference between the two of them, and I always said if I could kind of mix them up and, shake them up and split them apart, they would be like, really fantastic athletes. But with her, it was because she was so naturally good at everything. She had the hardest time when she got to the highest levels because
Hmm.
everybody else was just as good,
Yeah.
and so that failure of I'm not going to be the best at everything I do, and I have to get comfortable at that, and I
Yeah.
just have to work harder. That has to fuel me, which is what
Yeah.
happened with my son. It fueled him to get better.
That kind of gets at another question I had for you, and that's how do people respond to failure? So let's say the stage is set, the culture's there, leadership is demonstrating, and they feel safe, for the most part. Even at that level, I think people individually have their own sort of battles that they're fighting emotionally or mentally to not want to fail. And in each category, each of those types, I think it applies. What that might look like for reputation, or what that might look like for their future prospect for that role or project, whatever. How do people um, typically get over that hump of being more comfortable with their own failure as they're experimenting?
Yeah, again, it goes to resilience. As a matter of
Yeah.
fact, I'm developing a program I'll be leading next week for one of our customers that's about that very thing.
Yeah.
Because again, some of us have a harder time than others with it. But resilience, again, it's a muscle. It's something you can
Yeah.
build. It's not
Yeah.
something
It's
that you
true.
just have to be born with. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because
Hmm.
I've had many challenges in my life. And the one thing that when you ask people about me, they say, Karen is incredibly resilient. Like of anybody I've ever known, she is incredibly resilient. And I've thought a lot about, is that natural? Or is that something that I learned over time? And can I
Right.
teach it to other people? Because I'm at the age where I'm kind of looking back at how can I give back? How can I help young
Hmm.
leaders? How can I, help to build them into greater leaders? And I really feel like that's a solid area. And so it's about, first of all, mindset. We talked about that a
Hmm.
minute ago. You have to have that growth mindset. You have to
Hmm.
be willing to learn, and you have to have that, that inner ability to move forward. You have to set yourself up for success, both individually and with a support network. So you have to have people around you who will support you as you go through that difficult time to help you get to the other side. Your habits, your practices, those things set you up to be more resilient. Things like for me, my goal is I walk an hour every single day, and typically that hour is used to learn something. I'm walking dogs, but it's something that I need to keep me even, especially in stressful times. And sometimes if something really stressful is going on in the middle of the day and I feel like I can't really figure it out because I'm overwhelmed by that, we're going to go on another walk. I'll go
Hmm.
outside. I want to get in nature. I need to think. And then I
Yeah.
clear my head and I come back and I can do that. Some people
Yeah.
meditate, that's the way that they do that.
Yeah.
Some people pray. I mean, it's just different things, but you have to figure out what are those things that you can do to
Hmm.
set yourself up to be more resilient.
Yeah, that's great. If we're looking at the simplify methodology, how in those four different kind of dynamics, and the evaluation part, how does that align, or I guess how does it align with the DISC sort of behavior methodology?
Yeah, I don't, I'm not a disc expert, so I'll say that
Okay.
to start with. Um, but it's looking at something different. Again, ours is based off of original research. It's based off of the way that people move through the cycle of experience from
Yeah.
awareness to action. It's based off of Mike Sturm's, 30
Oh
years of
yeah.
his life trying
Hmm.
to develop this methodology. It's about energy. It's about, which ironically, when I first started the company in 2010, you talked about energy and people are like, ooh, must be a California company, very
Yeah.
woo woo, right? But now everybody's talking about it because they
Yeah.
recognize that it's a real thing. If you think about the task that you do throughout the day, there are things you're drawn to that give you energy, and there are things that
Hmm.
drain your energy. So it's a physical thing. So what are those things that give
Hmm.
you energy? So we're looking at different things. They're complementary, different
Yeah.
views on what things are, what's what. But ours is also process based. It's about moving
Right.
from one phase of work to the next. So it's not personality based. So
That's right. You did mention the process part, and that
yeah.
makes a lot of sense of how it differs. And I think that's probably some crossover. Maybe not lay right on top of each other, but the calculating on the disc sounds very similar to an examiner. Someone that has to be precise and have their ducks in a row, type of thing. So there's probably some alignment there if companies are already using the disc. But I like that how it follows. It's the thinking is more process oriented, action oriented, movement oriented, based around the energy of each type. I think that is very unique. I think it's very unique compared to the other types of things that you take. Like Myers Briggs is very personality driven.
No.
I mean, we're complex as as individuals, and it's not, you can't take one test and have, a good handle on someone.
Right. Yeah, it's just a different lens, and it's again,
Mhm.
it's process and it's applied. Certainly, early in my career, I had been exposed to other things, and I was like, "Yeah, this is interesting." But then I would go back to my job, and nothing really changed.
Yeah.
But with this, it just gets into your soul. It gets into the way that you think, the way that you
Yeah.
work. My kids have often told me, "Mom, not everything is five dynamics," and I'm like, "Well, everything can be equated. You can
You're
look at
like, well, you don't know because you're not old enough to know, but
Right, right.
yeah.
I think about like the movie Moneyball, the
Oh, right. Yeah.
Brad Pitt movie, where they had this great
Statistics.
idea. They had the statistics, they had the
Yeah.
data, they were
Yeah.
trying to move this new system forward.
Uh-huh.
But what they didn't do initially was they didn't get buy in. So they had
Buy-in.
the explore, the examine, and the execute. But it wasn't until the end that Billy Bean figured out, I need to get buy in from these players. And he went to them
Hmm.
one by one. And guess what? It's now successful because now they've addressed all four dynamics, all four
That's
phases.
huge. Yeah, that's a great example of how to explain what it is that this is. That made a lot more sense to me now that you said that. And I think it's so interesting because I think companies really could be empowered by this methodology, this process driven. Because I'm thinking, like, when you said that, just a couple ideas popped in my head about conversations I've had with other colleagues and clients about why things have stalled,
Mhm.
and buy-in was a huge piece of that. And I think it's not the only piece. There's other pieces, but that's very intriguing.
Yeah. When I was with my first big company, I was on the Inc. 500 list 2 years in a row. And I remember the first year that I went, I was in a seminar, and because it was the Inc. 500 back then, by the way, it's Inc.
Hmm.
5000 now. But I was in a seminar, and they were talking about something, and a gentleman stood up and he was talking about his employee issues. And he said, well, what I did is I fired them all. I just, cleaned house, started all over. And then the Inc. people the next year, they had him on stage talking about that. And I remember being at the time, even though I wasn't in this space, I just thought, wow, if you had to fire everybody, maybe you were part of that problem. And maybe you need to
Yeah.
look at this a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I was so drawn to this, because
Yeah.
it gives you, in 3 minutes or less, it gives you simple answers. And so even today, when I go into various organizations, people are complaining about their employees. And I just, I want to say, I have the answer. I can help you, but you can't do that in every situation that you're in. But
Yeah.
to me, it's so simple now. It's just so easy. It's
I
not
love
about
it.
personality. It's like you're thinking differently than I am. You're wanting to move faster than I am, or you're wanting to move slower, or you're wanting to think about this idea for longer than I want to think about it, or you want to
Yeah.
make sure the people are taken care of. But it's understanding what is at the core. What is that base desire? What are they optimizing for? And then how can you meet them in the middle? How can you
Hmm.
meet them halfway and have better product outcomes because of it?
Yes. 100%. I love it. This is great.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for coming on. This has been such a great discussion, and I think it's very important. And I think it'd be very empowering for a lot of companies. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Now, if I want to send people your way, where do we send them?
Simplify.com is our website.
And that's with a five,
Yes, SIMPLI and the number five,
five.
simplify.com.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks a lot, Karen, and we'll have you back on.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It was a great experience. Bye.